Hello and welcome to Stuart Saturday Live with me, your hostess, Andrea Zuvich, the 17th century lady. My guest today will be historian Stuart Orme, who is the curator of the Cromwell Museum. He'll be with us shortly. Well, autumn is well and truly here. And for my family, this means chillier woodland walks, such as in this image. Um, this is a walk we regularly do. It's a wood that used to be part of Sherwood Forest. And we also go on hikes in the gorgeous Peak District. And that's me here at Kerber Edge a few weeks ago. It's so beautiful. The scenery is spectacular. So if you can visit at any point, I would really recommend you going and exploring the beautiful scenery of this area here in Derbyshire. So we like to do these autumnal walks, and we like to follow them up with a stop at a cozy pub with a roaring fire and a good book. I love that. So for Halloween, which was last week, I set a challenge for people to recreate a 17th century portrait, and many people accepted, and it was great fun. We had several contributions which were fantastic, such as this from our previous Stuart Saturday Live guest, novelist and historian Nicola Cornick. Here she was recreating Prince Rupert and his dog from the Dobson portrait at Ashdown House. Just look at that dog. That expression is priceless. Next up, Lee Proudfoot submitted his fine interpretation of this portrait of William Pendrell on the left, who was a tenant at Boscobel House, who donated his clothes to Charles II during the latter's epic escape following his defeat at the Battle of Worcester. After that, we have Susan Margaret Cooper, who recreated The Plague Doctor from Rome by Paulus I from 1656. Wow, spooky and 17th century, so perfect for Halloween. So well done to everyone who participated. And I look forward to maybe doing this next year, maybe? It was great. My contribution was something that I ended up spending 2.5 weeks working on. And it's this dress that you see behind me. I thought I'd save some time for once and use my sewing machine, but there were a series of problems. My needle broke first, and then there were problems with the calibration, and finally it stopped working completely within 5 minutes of starting it up. So I ended up doing the whole thing by hand. I still haven't added all the embellishments, but this is my interpretation of the portrait of Barbara Villiers, circa 1670, as painted by John Michael Wright. I would like to take a photo again once it's done, this time without having to rush around in order to be ready for the trick-or-treaters. But it was fun. And I didn't have a shepherdess staff, so I had to make do with a feather duster. But it was a nice one. It was a nice one that I got at Blenheim Palace of all places. So, yeah. Anyway, I really enjoyed all of that. And as I said, I'd love to see more of this wonderful participation from everyone in the Stuart Saturday community. So please, more of that. Thank you. And now it's time for our history chat. If you're on social media and enjoy 17th century history, you'll probably already be well acquainted with the fantastic, informative posts from Stuart Orme, the curator at the Cromwell Museum. If you don't already know about him, you're in for a treat. Joining us live from that museum in Huntingdon, England, please welcome Stuart Orme.
Hi, Andrea. How are you doing?
Hi, thank you so much for being here with us today.
You're very welcome. Lovely to join you this afternoon and have a chat.
Well, I'll go right into it, shall I? What first interested you in the history of the 17th century and history in general?
History in general, somebody bought me a plastic dinosaur when I was 5, and it kind of started from there.
Nice.
I first got interested in the 17th century, I think, when I was about 10, and I think about 4 things happened. First, I went to a sort of Civil War reenactment, an English Civil War reenactment, and that sort of
Mhm.
interested me. I also was reading at the time all of Rosemary Sutcliffe's novels, the great historical children's novelist,
Right.
who's most famous for writing books about the Romans, sort of the famous Eagle of the Ninth. But she also wrote one called The Rider of the White Horse, which tells the story of Thomas Fairfax during the Civil War. And I loved that book. It's still one of my sort of favourite historical novels even today. And I think it would actually make a really good movie if anybody's out there and interested. I also saw the film Cromwell on the telly around the same time, and I think we'll come back to that film a bit later on.
Yeah.
And also, it was about the same time that By the Sword Divided came out, sort of the BBC costume drama, which I still
Yes.
think is one of the best depictions of the Civil War period that's yet been done on screen, and ran for 2
Right.
series. And all of that together, I think, was sort of one of the things that kind of whetted my appetite for this particular period of history.
That's fantastic. And it goes to show that films and that sort of media really do have an impact, and can open this world of history to people.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. I think popular culture is hugely important. I think through sort of novels, through film, through TV, through podcasts and broadcasts like this, social media,
Yes.
through museums, of course, as
Mhm.
well. So all of those things, which are sort of perhaps some of the more accessible end of understanding and getting to know a little bit about history, are a good way of engaging with people. And of course, then hopefully they'll go on to then read a bit more and understand more afterwards as well, and find this complex and fascinating period as interesting as we obviously do.
Yeah. Fantastic. Uh, you're the curator of the Cromwell Museum,
Mm.
of course, named after Oliver Cromwell, who, in my experience, remains a highly controversial figure,
Yeah.
seen as heroic by some and monstrous by others.
Mm.
But as is often the case, the truth is somewhere in the middle, isn't it?
Mm.
We have an image here of the man himself, Oliver Cromwell. Could you tell us about what he's wearing in this image, please? And we'll just start off by getting an understanding of what kind of person he was, his upbringing, perhaps, please.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, I mean, our job as a museum is to tell Cromwell's story, warts and all, which is a very handy advertising phrase that he may or may not have invented, but we'll probably come back to that.
All right.
So, this painting here is probably the largest portrait of him that we've got in the museum's collections. It's actually a life-size painting, so it's about 2 meters
Oh,
tall. So,
amazing.
he's 5'8" in this painting, which is how tall we think he would have been in real life, which is about average height for somebody in the mid 17th century for a man of
Hmm.
this period. And this was probably painted in the spring of 1649, so shortly after the king was executed, but whilst Cromwell was at that stage preparing to depart for his infamous campaign in Ireland later that
Mm.
year. And he's dressed in the sort of full garb of a cavalry general, as you see here. So this is a way of showing off his status as a senior commander in the army. The rather strange stick that he's holding is a badge of office. This is a baton, his badge of rank. The boots that you've alluded to are bucket top boots, which are folded down here to make them easier to walk, allegedly. And the
They
lace
seem
show
very
off.
cumbersome, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. But it's also show off the exotic boot lace inside, so it's a sort of way of
Uh,
showing off.
mm,
His very hat, his buff coat, which is a sort of piece of armour in its own right, with the back and breastplate over the top. The artist got things a little bit wrong here because there's no actual fastenings at the shoulders, so there's no visible way that he'd actually been able to get into it. So
ah,
Robert Walker, the artist who painted this, made a bit of a goof there. And poking around the side, you can just see the hilt, the top of his sword. And we've actually got that particular sword in the museum's collections as well.
oh, that's awesome. That's wonderful. Fantastic. Thank you. Um, yes. So I wonder, what kind of upbringing did he have?
So we know he's born here in Huntingdon, which is the reason why the museum is here today,
Mhm.
in 1599, 25th of April. and he spends half his life here in this town. He's distantly related, of course, to Thomas Cromwell, who, of course, is the other famous Cromwell in British history. Very appropriate, given that here in the UK we're about to get the new series of Wolf Hall starting again tomorrow night on the television.
Yes.
The Cromwell, Thomas was Oliver's great-great-granduncle. Their family had kind of come down a bit in status by this time. Cromwell's uncle had inherited all the property, but unfortunately blown most of the family's wealth on royal entertaining. He entertained James I at too many house parties at the Grand Mansion at Hinchinbrook House. And
that was extremely expensive. That could potentially bankrupt some courtiers, couldn't it? I mean,
absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, James stopped off there on his way south in 1603 to his coronation, and then turned up 15 times thereafter. So you can imagine the expense of that. Pretty much bankrupted the Cromwell family. Cromwell's dad was Robert, lived in the centre of Huntingdon, and basically because he was the second son, he didn't have the wealth and property, so he made his living by the rents of a few houses. I suppose today you might call him a kind of buy-to-let landlord, if you like. And so we know very little about Cromwell's childhood. There are all sorts of myths and stories, most of which emerge in later centuries. But we know he went to school in the building that's today our museum, and then went to university in Cambridge, which he was studied at Sydney Sussex College. He was only there for just over a year before his dad died. And as the only son, he had to come back and look after his mum and 6 sisters. So he then kind of took over the family business, as it were. So that was sort of his early life. He doesn't seem to have been especially a great student. There's no indication he was particularly religious at this stage. His religious conversion and interest in Puritanism comes around a bit later on.
I see. Wow. Do we have any idea what kind of pastimes he enjoyed?
Yeah, so I mean, the popular image of Cromwell is that he's this kind of dour character who's sort of Mr. Killjoy, all dressed in black. Actually, I mean, we know that in his early life, he's actually quite scruffy. When he first emerges in Parliament, he's usually commented on that he's badly dressed by some ill-fitting country tailor and got blood on his collar from where he's cut himself shaving. Interestingly, there are no portraits of him wearing black at all. And he's described as wearing black in a few contemporary descriptions, but the fact that it's mentioned that he wore black specifically shows that it actually seems to have been quite unusual. As we know, the black-clad Puritan is a bit of a myth anyway. We know he likes music, just not in church as a Puritan. We know he likes, he's up for a party and dances with the ladies at parties. And has quite a well-developed sense of humour, which seems to result in practical jokes. There's the famous account of him getting quite drunk at one of his daughter's weddings, dancing with all the ladies and playing practical jokes on his new son-in-law by pinching his wig and running away with it and hiding it. And there's actually been a new article published just very recently by Patrick Little, who's turned up an account of another wedding in Northamptonshire in the 1650s, where Cromwell was apparently quite a pain in the backside as a wedding guest, where apparently he got bored in the wedding reception and started chucking cushions at some of the ladies who were present, and then started a custard pie fight with some of his officers. So it's not the image we tend to have of him, but actually, he's, I often said to people, I think if the whoopee cushion had been invented in the 1650s, Cromwell probably would have bought them. That was his sense of humour. But he likes falconry. He's not averse to a drink or two. He smokes tobacco. Bulstrode Whitelock talks about him stopping for a sort of pipe break during meetings, for example. He's a little bit more different to perhaps the popular image of him.
Right. So quite we could say almost a jokey sort of fellow, and not particularly religious early on.
No, he develops that in the 1630s after his depressive episode, which we'll come on to.
Right.
He's somebody who is a deeply emotional person, I think, in many respects, which I think plays into his depression. We know that he has swings of emotion. He can get almost teary-eyed very easily, but also can have fits of laughter. And he also fits of anger as well. He loses his temper
Mm.
quite easily. So some people have sort of suggested that he actually might have been, in modern terms, sort of bipolar. That sort of
Mm.
might explain some of his sort of mood swings, as it were.
Right. So, what do you think drove him into the political scene?
Early on, he's briefly MP for Huntingdon in the Parliament that sat before Charles I dismissed Parliament in 1628, 1629. He's MP for Huntingdon then, and he's a bit of a nobody, really. And likewise, when Parliament is recalled in 1640, and he's persuaded to stand as one of the borough MPs for Cambridge, largely because the town council there shared similar religious views to him. And he's a backbench MP. He's pretty much a nobody. We'd have never heard of Cromwell if it wasn't for the Civil War. He's quite an efficient committee man, and he attaches himself to the junto, the faction that's opposed to Charles I's policies. And he then gets his commission in Parliament's armies on the basis of his station in society. He sort of becomes a cavalry captain. But again, he's, a junior cavalry officer at the age of 43. It wasn't for the Civil War then, and the fact that he turned out to be a very successful soldier, he'd have been just a footnote in a local history book. We'd have never heard of him. And because of his
work.
It is, yeah. I mean, it's to everybody's surprise, really. He's never picked up a sword in his life before, as far as we can tell, but he turns out to be good at it. And he's quite charismatic in his own kind of rough way. He's good with people. He's good with horses. He breeds horses. He races horses. So he knows, he's good at the basis of a cavalry commander. He's very organised, and he realises the importance of logistics, which is often forgotten when we talk about Cromwell's success as a soldier. He realises that, he can recruit soldiers, but if he can't pay them or feed them, they're no good to anybody. And so he becomes very good at that. He also becomes very good, as Ronald Hutton has pointed out recently, at self-publicity, bigging himself up, which is presumably to get resources and so on initially, but he also uses that as a weapon against political opponents later on as well, quite ruthlessly. And he basically, because of his military success, he becomes more listened to in Parliament. So his political significance, I think, is as a reflection of the fact that his military success during the Civil War kind of propels him forward.
I see. Well, it's very interesting, all of this, because it's so different from this general idea we have of him. In light of all this, I'd like to know what you think. Was he an ambitious sort of man?
It's difficult to say, really. I mean, certainly he was on a level of personal ambition. I think there are certain expectations within society of the time, so there's an element of that. I think it's not so much ambition from the point of view of self-aggrandizement. What he's looking for, particularly after he has his religious conversion in the 1630s as a Puritan, he's looking for God's providence. What has God put me here for? And he's seeking to try and understand that when he sort of becomes effectively a kind of born-again Puritan through sermons, through prayer, and through close study of the Bible. And like most Puritans, he's looking for that kind of providential message. What is the purpose for here on earth? And therefore, am I going to earn my place in heaven afterwards? And that's quite difficult for us to understand today with our very secular society in the 21st century. Of course, this was absolutely central to many people's faith in the 1600s.
Indeed.
And I think he then sees his military success as suddenly, you can see very particularly one particular letter, when early on in the Civil War, he's very much writing almost very tremulously, very nervously about his military career. He doesn't quite know that he's up to this. And then when he wins his first significant victory at the Battle of Gainsborough in July 1643, suddenly the language changes in the letter. And he's no longer talking about we did this, it's now I did this. And it's sort of suddenly, it's like the light bulb moment. It's sort of, the message, the light bulb has gone on in his head. And he suddenly thinks, hang on a minute, this is what I'm here for. And for want of a better description, he's kind of on a mission from God at that point. You know, this is suddenly as
Well,
he
that makes
sees it, it's
sense.
God's providence for him.
Yeah. Well, that really makes sense in the context of the time period and everything. Um, just to go back to the image, please. It's stunning portrait. Is this the Lily?
Yes, so this is the famous Lely sort of warts and all portrait. So there's about 6 or 7 copies of these around the world. This is the one in our collection. So the original, which one is the progenitor, the original, is difficult to know. It's quite possibly the one in Birmingham or maybe the one in the Pizzi Palace in Florence. As was often the case with heads of states, there were multiple copies produced of the same paintings, or studio copies. And it's painted around 1653, and this is the one where reputedly when Cromwell went to sit for Lely, he was already getting his reputation as a sort of portrait painter, but also, as we know, particularly with his restoration portraits, was well known for sort of, shall we say, making people maybe look a little better than they really were. So, you know, gilding the lily, as it were. And supposedly when Cromwell went to sit for him, he says to Lely, Mr. Lely, I require you to use the best of your talents. Paint me as I am, pimples, warts and everything. Otherwise I shall pay you a farthing for the painting. And of course, this is from where we derive the phrase warts and all. Of course, actually, you know, the painting, although it does depict Cromwell and his warts, and it does fit with the character of the man being barely lack of, you know, great vanity, he's depicted here in a suit of armour he would never have worn. It was out of fashion by this period. So it's an artistic shorthand to show that he's a military commander. And the earliest account we have of this famous quote was written over 100 years after Cromwell's death. So it's quite possible, like quite a number of the things that Cromwell is attributed as having said, that actually he may well not have said them at all.
Yeah, I get that a lot with the things, the topics that I have to cover in the late 17th century. Yeah. There are so many apocryphal stories and stories that have just been, they just come out of nowhere later. There's
a load of those with Cromwell, absolutely, yeah.
Yes. Oh wow! And the thing is, it's heavily biased because there are people who hate a historical figure, and they will invent something horrible, and also people who really have some kind of adulation for a particular person, and so it could be very skewed. So you have to see things, try to see things in its proper setting, I think.
Absolutely the case. And I mean, yeah, we always look for contemporary evidence. I mean, going back to what I said earlier about Cromwell's childhood, there are loads of legends which, for those of us of a certain age, are always trotted out in the Ladybird book on Cromwell about his childhood, about him being kidnapped by his uncle's pet monkey as a child and having a fight with the future Charles I in the grounds of Hinchinbrook House when they're both schoolboys. And they're lovely stories, but they all emerge in the 18th century when there wasn't very much known about Cromwell's childhood and there was a beginnings of a popular interest in him. So basically people made stuff up. It's what, I suppose, in Hollywood screenwriter terms today would be called inventing a backstory for someone. So,
it adds extra drama, doesn't it? If they had that previous enmity, a little spat between.
Yes, it's the foreshadowing, you know, it's all of that sort of thing. Yeah. And again, it's a lovely idea. And actually, we do know that the future Charles I did visit Hinchinbrook twice with his father on his father's frequent visits. So it's in one sense, it's possible. But, you know, we've no evidence for it at all. It sort of seems to emerge much later on.
Right. Very interesting. There's a lot of talk about Cromwell and the draining of the fens. For those who do not know what the fens are, could you explain what they are and what do they have to do with Oliver Cromwell, please?
Yeah, okay. So the Fenland area today is sort of, I suppose, much of kind of Cambridgeshire, Huntingdonshire, parts of South Lincolnshire, going into bits of Norfolk. It's a sort of region that nowadays is mostly just flat farmland. But back in the 17th century was marshland. This was all undrained marshland at that time. as it had been since the Middle Bronze Age, when the sort of whole area flooded. So you've got lots of communities in this area, which are small, isolated communities, many of them deeply religious, many of whom make their living from the fens, so by traditional trades like catching eels, wildfowling, fishing, gathering reeds from the marshes, which they use to thatch houses and that sort of thing. Over the centuries, there have been various attempts to drain the fens and create new farmland. There have been, back in Roman times, there have been a little bit in the Middle Ages, but there's a systematic attempt from the 1630s. And this is licensed by Charles I, who sort of licenses people like the Duke of Bedford as businessmen to invest in these schemes to create fen drainage, using a lot of the techniques and technologies that have been used to reclaim land in Holland and the Low Countries. And they bring over Dutch engineers with expertise in this, people like Cornelius Vermuyden. And most people agree that actually fen drainage is a good idea, that sort of the drainage of the fens will create more farmland that's going to feed an expanding population, that overall over the long term it'll be a good thing. Right. The problem is, of course, there are many local people who are losing their livelihoods as the landscape is changing. These traditional trades that I mentioned are disappearing, and there's no provision made for compensating them. A lot of people feel threatened by changes in society as a result. There are some who even turn to violence. There are kind of almost like early Luddites, people who call themselves fen tigers, who go out and smash up the drainage works and pull them down because they disagree with what's happening. And so there is a sort of disagreement in this region over the sort of the scale and speed of the fen drainage, and the fact that a lot of people are losing out as a result. And what's interesting is when the Civil War breaks out, a reason why a lot of people in this area support Parliament is because, of course, the King has licensed the people doing the fen drainage. So that's seen as being associated with him particularly. And supposedly Cromwell championed a lot of the people who were losing out. So that's why he's a sort of associated with this. He certainly seems to have stood up for some locally whilst he was living in Ely. Interesting, later on, when he becomes Lord Protector, he does actually also then push through the process of carrying on with the fen drainage, but possibly in a slightly more restrained way.
I see. Wow. That is, it could be a whole other topic on its own, can't it?
It is, yeah. So, I mean, it shows how often sometimes, when people, for instance, the Civil War broke out, it wasn't just over national politics. Sometimes people chose sides down to local politics in the same way as, people are affected by choose how to vote in elections today based on local issues as much as national ones.
Yeah. And personal experiences can definitely impact someone's allegiance.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. And it's really good to see both sides of a question. I think that's a very good thing to do, so that, we can have a fuller understanding of every topic. And so he was a family man, and he had a large family.
Yeah.
What sort of relationship did he have with his wife and children?
So, I mean, he has a large extended family who end up living with him. So, as I say, from at the age of 17, 18, he's responsible looking after his mother and his 6 sisters. Then he marries in 1620 a lady called Elizabeth Bourchier, who, how they met, we're not quite sure. It may well have been an arranged marriage. This was actually quite common for 17th century middle-class marriages. But they seem to have had a very devoted relationship to each other, and in the few surviving bits of correspondence between the two of them are actually very sweet. He writes to her from Campaign in 1650, where he says, "Thou art dearer to me than any creature." And she writes back and says, "My life is but half a life in your absence." And they've been married for 30 years at this point, so it's quite sweet.
That's really nice.
It's, isn't it? It's like something from a Valentine's Day card. Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting. One of the new areas of historical research actually is looking at the influence of women on Cromwell's life. He's always been brought up in a very household with a lot of women folk around him. And actually, if you look at his surviving correspondence, a lot of his personal letters to women, he's actually far more open and relaxed talking to women than he is to his male colleagues. So he's quite interesting in that regard. He has 9 kids. Of those, 1 dies in infancy, 2 die relatively young, 1 of illness whilst away at school, 1 while during the Civil War of disease, which of course was a far bigger killer of the actual fighting, like most conflicts pre-1900. And the rest, I mean, they're all fairly close-knit. They all write correspondence to each other. They quite often have pet names for each other. Again, it's not kind of what you'd expect. They're a fairly sort of close-knit sort of family, and a lot of their correspondence is actually quite modern in many respects.
Oh, interesting. So his wife, Elizabeth, she's quite a fascinating character in herself. Wasn't she the author of a cookery book, or there was a cookery book purportedly written by her and published in, I think, 1664?
Yeah.
Could you explain about that? What all about that, please?
So yes, there's the Court and Kitchen of Elizabeth Cromwell. This is her here. There as a younger woman, you can see in this particular painting. Her name was Elizabeth. Yeah, it's lovely actually. We've got 2 paintings of her, this one and then one of her as Lady Protectress. And yeah, I mean, her name Elizabeth Bourchier. Her father was a wealthy London fur dealer, and as I say, she and Cromwell seem to have had this devoted relationship. This strange cookbook, which we've got an original copy of in the museum, was published, as you say, after the Restoration. And I describe it as one of the weirdest cookery books ever written, because it's sort of 2/3 middle-class recipes from this period, as you'd expect. And then 1/3 is an essay saying how awful the Cromwells were. And part of it is using the recipes as a stick to beat Elizabeth with, and therefore by in turn kind of muddy Cromwell's reputation. So part of the argument is things like, look, these people came from the fens and ate things like eels. How could they have been allowed to run the country? So there's a bit of snobbery going on with it.
Yeah, gosh.
But also Elizabeth, particularly herself, is accused of being a poor housewife. She's being accused of being financially grasping and very sort of keen on acquiring treasures and so on. She's accused of being sexually immoral, so that which even the name Joan is used in the title, which is a name often associated with ladies of negotiable virtue in the mid-17th century. And she's accused of manipulating her husband, almost being a kind of Lady Macbeth character. And actually, what I find interesting is if you take those 4 things, the sort of, the accusations of being poor with money, of being keen on getting more money, of being sexually immoral, and of being manipulative of menfolk, those are the things that are still used in the media to rubbish many women's reputations even today. So it's interesting those sorts of techniques have still carried on 370 years later, unfortunately.
Wow. Aside from his role as one of the regicides of Charles I, Oliver Cromwell is also infamously known for his dealings with Ireland, which you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
This is a complex situation, but for those who are less acquainted with this subject, what was the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland, and what was Cromwell's mindset about the Irish and Ireland?
It is, yeah. And the 2 things that have stained Cromwell's reputation over the centuries, one obviously is for centuries, for a long time, was the act of regicide, killing your king. And for a long time, that was sort of the mage charge against Cromwell, although nowadays people are divided much more over whether or not Charles I was deserving of that or not. As far as Ireland is concerned, yeah, I mean, it's a complex story, but to give very, very brief overview, obviously there have been English overlordship of Ireland since the Middle Ages. Since the Tudor period, there had been concerns when England had gone through the Reformation that Ireland, which was predominantly, well, was at that stage entirely Catholic, would be used as a jumping off point for Catholic invasion of England by foreign powers. There was also a strong racial hatred or dislike of the Irish as being sort of, you know, but lower than people in England, as it were. So there's an element of racism to it as well, but a lot of it is down to religion. From the reign of Elizabeth I, there is this dreadful process of what's called transplantation. Every now and again, when there is a rebellion by Irish Catholics, their land is confiscated and given to Protestant settlers. And this is the beginnings, of course, of the religious divide in Ireland that, of course, still exists even today, particularly a large settlement of Protestants during the reign of James I in Ulster, sort of the area what today we call Northern Ireland. When the royal authority collapses in Ireland by 1641, because Charles I is more concerned with obviously rising tensions with Parliament in England in the run-up to the Civil War, a number of Catholics over there take the opportunity to create a rising, and it's the infamous 1641 Irish Rebellion, where Irish Catholics rise up and slaughter about 5,000 Protestant settlers. It has to be said the Protestants turn around and probably slaughtered a similar number of Catholics. And civil war breaks out in Ireland. That's often forgotten about is the dreadful Confederate wars that run in parallel to what's going off in Britain between King and Parliament. In order, when this happens, Parliament and the King both cook up a plan whereby they're going to pre-sell shares in any confiscated land in Ireland to investors. It's creating an army by a PFI contract in modern terms. So they basically pre-sell shares in 40% of the contracted land in Ireland, raise £1 million. And from this, the plan was to fund an army to go out and put down the Irish Rebellion. Of course, what Parliament does is use the £1 million in order to fund the war against the King. Of course, once the King is then executed in 1649, City of London turns round to Parliament and says, so £1 million, please, or the land we were promised. So at which point, of course, also at that stage, there is concern that now things have settled down in England and Scotland, that so things are seen to be, you know, King has been executed, Parliament reigns supreme, Ireland is the next issue. So Cromwell is sent out there to bring Ireland to heel. He goes out there in September 1649. He's out there for 9 months. Whilst he is out there, he subjugates Ireland with, I think, the polite way of putting it would be ruthless efficiency. He takes 30 towns or garrisons, 28 of which actually surrender on generous terms and actually are well treated. But the reason why they're so keen to surrender is because of what happened to the first two. The first particularly, which of course is the town of Drogheda, which Cromwell surrounds and then in September 1649 bombards, and because it refuses to surrender, he storms the town. The garrison, which is a mixture of both Irish Catholics and Protestants and some English royalists, including the governor, Sir Arthur Aston. Many of them are killed in the fighting. Aston himself is beaten to death with his own wooden leg. Others who are captured are forced to go through detonation. So 1 man in 10 is ordered to beat the others to death. Well, he's beaten to death by his colleagues. Around modern estimates are around about 600 civilians die that night in the town, which are sort of the dreadful words that will be used on the news today are collateral damage. Under the rules of war as were understood in the 17th century, Cromwell was acting within the rules. If he'd been put in front of a court-martial, he'd have been acquitted because he'd given the town the chance to surrender and they'd refused. But whilst he might have been operating within the letter of the law, he probably wasn't, I have to say, operating within the spirit of it. And it was the biggest loss of life in any of the sieges of any of the civil wars in Britain and Ireland. I think some of the things that happened that night, you absolutely have to say that, you know, would be war crimes.
Yes.
As a result of which, and subsequently, Wexford was stormed bloodily as well. And to be fair to Cromwell, he lost control of his troops on that occasion. He actually wanted to capture the town intact. They found a way in the back gate, and a massacre followed thereafter. But yes, I mean, it's understandable why today that Cromwell is reviled in Ireland because of what happened at Drogheda. And of course, and subsequently, although Cromwell leaves after 9 months, other commanders carry on after his departure. So Henry Ireton, Charles Fleetwood, and with the guerrilla war that follows thereafter, there things get so unpleasant. There are, further massacres of civilians, and of course the mass confiscations of Irish property. In most cases, this is not removing people off their land, but they no longer own it. They're now just reduced to being tenant farmers on land that had been previously belonged to them. And as a result of which, in terms of land ownership, it's a form of ethnic cleansing.
Yes.
And that's on Parliament's orders in the early 1650s.
Well, that's utterly, utterly dreadful, all of that. But
it is, and it's a pattern, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Cromwell is one of many throughout this period, and unfortunately, I think he's a convenient scapegoat sometimes, I think, because the process then carries on after the Restoration and well into the 1670s. It's a dreadful process.
Yes, indeed. So we've covered this the most negative part, perhaps, of Oliver Cromwell's legacy. But as with so much history, there are myths associated with him. You have already mentioned a few, but would you please go on and bust a few of those myths for us today? I mean, which ones do you come across on a regular basis at work, for example?
Yeah, loads all the time. The thing is, everybody associates everything with Cromwell because he's the person we've all heard of, particularly from the parliamentarian corps, is what I call sometimes omnipresent Oliver syndrome. He gets tagged with everything, even though lots of things he had nothing to do with. So he gets the credit for stuff he didn't do. So he gets, you'd think from a lot of stuff that Cromwell won the Civil War for Parliament single-handed. And yeah, he's important. But actually, certainly from the First Civil War, I'd, argue Thomas Fairfax was far more important than Cromwell in many respects.
Yes.
Of course, the most famous one he gets blamed for, of course, is the banning of Christmas, which actually he himself has relatively little to do with. And actually, we don't know his views on Christmas whatsoever. And also the Christmas ban itself has been inflated dramatically because of actually it was wildly ineffective. Hardly anybody paid any attention to it because it was just pretty much unenforceable.
Yeah, because they wanted to celebrate their Christmas anyway.
Yeah, and in an age when there's no police force and, no CCTV or whatever else, how the heck do you stop people having a Christmas party behind closed doors? It's just impossible. And the one that boggles the mind always is that, particularly on social media every year around Christmas, is that you see people about, Cromwell banned pies or mince pies, which is deeply weird. I mean, given that pies were a staple part of the diet in the 17th century, it'd be like stopping potatoes today. It's impossible. But and then there's no evidence for this whatsoever. It's just one of those weird stories that comes up. And mince pies in the 17th century even weren't specifically associated with Christmas. They were just as commonly eaten at weddings. So it's like one of those many things that you just bundle at sometimes and go, I'm sorry, what?
And also, they're not the same kind of mince pies we have in the stores now.
No, actually meat pies. And the other thing is, of course, the number of people who will come in and tell me that, we get visitors also, of course, from all over the world and particularly from all over the UK. And the number of people who will tell me that, Cromwell stayed in their local pub. If I added together all the places Cromwell was supposed to have stayed, he must have lived to about 156. So, it's a bit like Elizabeth I slept here. You have to take it with a bit of a pinch of salt.
Yeah. I like how some places now say this was built for this monarch to come, but they never came. So that seems more likely. Yes,
there's a pub in St Ives down the road which Cromwell said to haunt, which is a clever trick given the fact it's not built to over 100 years after his death. So,
yeah, okay. Oh, wow. So it's let's see. He suffered from ill health throughout his life, including having melancholia, and you referred to this earlier. but that was what it was called, wasn't it, at the time?
Yeah, so melancholia is what's kind of, I suppose, today, it's difficult to define
Mm,
overlapping of 17th century medical definitions with today. But
yeah.
he does seem to have suffered from what today we'd call depression throughout his life. He was first
Hmm.
diagnosed in 1628 by a Swiss doctor called Theodore Mayerne, who was operating in London. And he has periodic bouts throughout his life. The first one lasted for a number of years, and whilst he's living in St Ives, this is when he has his religious awakening and becomes a
Hmm.
Puritan, I think probably as much as a sort of coping mechanism for one of his depressive episodes. Um, we actually have a letter in the museum's collections that's on display, in which he's written in 1652, in which he talks about his depression. And he says that he feels very isolated, very alone, doesn't know who he can talk to, that asking his friends to pray for him. It's sort of language that sort of, for anybody who's been through those dark periods in your life, you'd recognize the language and the tone of the letter. So yes, he has that. We know he also suffered from the ague, as they called it, what today we call
Mm,
malaria,
yeah.
which he probably contracted from, of course, living in the fens with marshland here and mosquitoes,
Hmm.
which he has occasional bouts of again throughout his life. And latterly, he
Yeah.
had kidney stones as well. So, combination of these things are probably the things that kind of killed him. Plus,
Yes.
so we're going to just sort of moving on to that. I mean, we know he dies in September 1658 of a combination of these circumstances. Plus, he's physically
Hmm.
exhausted, and then I think when his favourite daughter Elizabeth, dies in August
Yeah.
that year of cancer, he's grief-stricken, and he pretty much gives
Mm,
up, and he's dead within 3 weeks. George Fox, the founder of the Quakers, who sort of met him one day, sort of commented that he looked like a dead man walking at that stage. So obviously he just sort of given up the ghost and was dead on the 3rd of September 1658.
yes. Well, um, grief in particular, that kind of grief, that kind of bereavement is, I can well understand
Yeah,
why it could impact someone so badly. So yes, I can well understand how that could have exacerbated his health and led to his death. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Um, This may be gruesome for our younger audience, so parents, please be aware of that. Following the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, there was a period in which those who had been responsible for the execution of King Charles I in 1649 were punished. Some got away lightly, but others were given the infamous hanging, drawing, and quartering.
Mm.
Um, but some others had what some today might consider an odd punishment, posthumous execution. So, what
Yeah.
happened to Cromwell's remains?
So yeah, he's buried a few weeks after his death in Westminster Abbey. He's actually given a
Mhm.
private funeral for his body with his family and friends. And then a few weeks later, he was given a full state funeral, which I've got a sneaking suspicion he probably wouldn't have approved of, not least the fact that
Mm.
it was modelled on that of James I. So it was actually a kind of
Oh,
royal funeral.
right.
But yeah, in January 1661, Cromwell's body was exhumed from Westminster Abbey along with those of John Bradshaw, who was the president of the trial of Charles I, and Cromwell's
Mhm.
son-in-law, Henry Ireton, who was really the kind of brains behind Charles's execution. And their corpses, now mummified, were taken to Tyburn in London, the main place of execution. They were then hanged there for about 6 hours, their bodies cut down, their heads hacked off. Apparently, Cromwell's took multiple hacks to remove. The bodies, there's various conspiracy theories about where the bodies might have ended up, but almost certainly they were thrown into the felon's burial pit alongside. So today, Cromwell's body probably lies under either Red Lion Square or under the end of Oxford Street near Marble Arch, which is where
Right.
the pit was. So his body was lost.
Oh,
His head was stuck on a spike outside the Palace of Westminster, where it remained on a spike for about the next 20, 25 years before there was a storm in the 1680s, and the spike it was on, the oak spike, snapped off just below the head. The head fell to the ground, this mummified head, and was picked up by a soldier on guard duty who was thought he'd keep it as a souvenir, but was frightened of being caught with it. So he sewed it up into a leather sack and then stuffed it up his chimney so he wouldn't be caught, and only confessed what he'd done to his daughter on his deathbed. She then sold it through various hands. It's ended up in a collection of a guy called Claudius Dupuy, who was a Swiss collector who exhibited in a private museum in London and made a lot of money showing it off to people. It then went through various hands until 1799, when it was sold to a bunch of investors who planned again to create an exhibition around Cromwell. But they got the exhibition wrong, and also there was an increasing distaste for exhibiting actual human remains at that point, so the exhibition flopped. And then in 1815, it was sold to a family called Wilkinson, who kept it for over 100 years. And they used to get it out, kept it in a wooden box on the mantelpiece, used to get it out and show it to people at dinner parties.
I wonder if they're related to my in-laws, the Wilkinsons.
Well, in 1935, the then owner, Canon Wilkinson, had it scientifically tested there. There was a rival Cromwell head in the collection of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and they rapidly proved the Ashmolean one was a fake. The scientists x-rayed, they measured it, they compared it to the portraits, the death masks and all the rest of it, and also the contemporary accounts of what had happened to Cromwell at his sort of post-mortem execution. And they concluded that that they were 99% certain that it genuinely was his head. Wow. And then in 1960, they then gave the head to Sidney Sussex College in Cambridge, where Cromwell went to university, and it was then buried in the chapel there, in a sort of an unmarked location, although there is a commemorative plaque on the wall. And I'm told by the college archivist that when they buried it there, they wanted to put it in an airtight container in order to preserve it. Unfortunately, the only airtight container they could find to accommodate the head, the wooden spike it was on, and the wooden box it came in was an old-fashioned catering-sized tin of biscuits. So yes, Cromwell's head is buried in a biscuit tin. Now, interestingly, our next exhibition, opening in a week or so's time, is actually on the story of Cromwell's head, and we actually have a few artifacts on loan to us very kindly from Sidney Sussex College, including this one. I'm giving you an exclusive here. This tiny little key here, if I just, whoops, there we go. That's it, in front of my, front of the camera. That tiny little key. That little key is the key to the wooden box that Cromwell's head is kept in.
No way.
Yeah. So the college, even though they buried the wooden box inside the biscuit tin and it's buried in the chapel, they kept the key to the box and they very kindly lent it to us. So that's an exclusive for Stuart Saturday.
Well, we've got that. That's great. Thank you. I'm sure lots of people are going to want to go and see that exhibition. And you have had several questions sent in, but well, amazingly, you've already answered 4 of the 5. So but this last question comes from my 8-year-old. Is it true that Oliver Cromwell had warts? Why are they on some masks and not on others?
That's a very good question. Yes, he did have warts, or as far as we can tell. Some of the artists put them on paintings, some of them don't, and I think that just depends on the artist. So Lely did. Samuel Cooper in his beautiful little portrait miniatures includes the warts. Robert Walker never put them on, and I think that's just artistic choice. The death mask, the one that was there was a wax impression taken of his face the day after he died, and the wart on the chin showed up. But for some reason, the wart on the forehead up here didn't. So interestingly, the early casts that were produced as for Cromwell's effigies at his state funeral don't show the wart on the forehead. In the Victorian period, when Cromwell became very popular for a time and there were lots of commercial copies of the death masks produced, the Victorians didn't think it looked enough like him without the wart on the forehead, so they stuck the wart on the forehead back on. And in fact, you can actually date the different Victorian death masks and the manufacturer by the positioning of the forehead wart, because they all put it in slightly different places.
Oh, well, there we go.
So a case of Cromwell and his wandering warts, there with that one.
That'd be a good title for something.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Well, the museum itself has a very interesting history.
Mm.
Could you tell us a bit about the museum and how it came to be what it is today, please?
Yes, this is our museum. This is the outside of the building. It's a beautiful medieval building. It's the oldest building in Huntingdon, originally part of a medieval religious house, providing
Oh,
accommodation to travellers coming through the town. That then, after the Reformation, became the town's grammar school. And so from 1565 up until the 1950s, it was still property of the local grammar school. And of course, in the 1600s, Cromwell went to school here between 1610 and 1616. And then a generation later, Samuel Pepys also went to school here as well. He was
yes.
so yeah. Pepys spent 2 years living in Huntingdon as a schoolboy
Mhm.
because he was sent out by his parents as an outbreak of plague in the capital. So he lived with his uncle at Brampton, just on the edge of Huntingdon, and went to school here. And he does talk about that in his famous diaries. And later, of course, he then inherited the property in Brampton, which still belongs to the Pepys Club today. Occasionally, they do guided tours of the property. And if you read Pepys's diaries, there's lots of references to him visiting Huntingdon, usually involving him going to one or other of the pubs and getting quite drunk. So, that's Sam Pepys for you.
That's him. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Fantastic.
So yeah, I mean, today we've got a collection of about 1,000 artifacts. It is the best collection in the world of artifacts relating to Cromwell. Some of them are on loan to us from Cromwell's family,
Yeah.
including many of the most famous portraits we've obviously seen, including his swords, what's reputed to be his hat, which is an iconic item in its own right, his medical chest, and various other things. And so, it's this beautiful building. It was opened in 1962. Interestingly, the same week as the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. So I think nuclear Armageddon occupied the front pages rather than the opening of the Cromwell Museum. And since 2015, we've been an independent museum since county council budget cuts. So we're an independent museum today. And so, yes, my job and privilege to look after this place.
That's lovely. So let's briefly focus on your role as curator. What does this job entail, and
If you watch television, people think that museum curator scenes is to sit inside a darkened room, usually with white gloves on, looking very intently at objects, because that's what they always film us doing on television. Most of the time, I'm sat in my office here doing like most people do, which is emails and spreadsheets. So usually relating to budgets and grant applications, because as an independent charity, I spend half my time doing grant applications. Please fund us and give us some money. But yeah, I mean, I manage the museum. We've got 2.5 staff, including myself, about 40 odd volunteers who work with us. And so, yeah, my job covers sort of managing all of those people, looking after the museum's collection, doing exhibitions, fundraising, occasionally leading guided tours, doing talks, doing things like this, managing my trustees and sort of the trustee meetings, dealing with all sorts of groups and organisations. So it's a varied job. And I suppose in a way I like the variety of that. But I do like doing talks of groups and getting people interested and excited about this period of history.
yes,
So
that's
that I
great.
suppose is the thing I like the most, I suppose, in a way, really.
Fantastic. That's wonderful. You currently have a watch on display at the
Mm.
museum, and it is beautiful. Just look at how beautiful that is, everyone. It's ornate, and how old is it? And what historical connections does it have, please?
So this watch was made. That's just the interior of the watch you can see here. It's
Mhm.
I mean, today to us it's classically beautiful. It's actually quite understated by the time standards of the 1640s, where a lot
Mhm.
of watches are very heavily decorated and enamelled and quite gaudy. This
Yeah.
tiny little watch is actually of a style known as a Puritan watch because the decoration is quite restrained by the standards of the
Mhm.
1600s. It's made by a guy called William Clay, who was a London watchmaker working in King Street in Westminster in the 1640s. And in 1647, Oliver Cromwell moved in 2 doors down from him. And we believe that Cromwell bought this watch. He subsequently presented it to one of his officers, John Blackwell, whilst on campaign in 1650. and it was then passed down through the Blackwell family until 2019. And it was then sold at auction. The current owner has very kindly lent it to us, and he's interested in potentially us purchasing it from him. So we are fundraising at the moment to buy this. I am proud to say that the £10,000 we needed to raise by public fundraising, we've now done that, which is great. So thank you very much to everybody who supported it. So we're now waiting on various grant giving bodies to fund the rest, because obviously it's rather more than £10,000 that the watch is worth. So we'll be hopefully making an announcement in the next couple of months, fingers crossed, that we've secured the watch and it'll be now here as its permanent home.
That would be perfect. And this is another image here, and
yeah, so you can see on the frontage here that there's at the top of the watch, there's a little hand with a finger pointing downwards towards the top, above the number 12.
yes,
So yeah, and it points to the gold band, which has got the numbers on it. So that would rotate around on a daily basis. So it was a watch that told you not only the day, the time, but the date as well. So that was sort of existing. And then
that's brilliant. I've not seen one like this.
yeah, so
that's incredible. Yeah.
So it's one of only 2 watches that can be reasonably provenance to belong to Cromwell that exist. The other is one very similar to this, but it's made of gold instead of silver, and that's in the collection of the British Museum in London. And yes, we'd like to try and secure this one.
Oh yes. Well, good luck.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, for those who are new to this part of history, what books, both non-fiction and fiction perhaps, would you recommend?
Well, I've mentioned my favourite fictional one already, sort of The Rosemary Sutcliffe on The Rider of the White Horse. I mean, in terms of non-fiction, there's loads of new stuff being written all the time, and I mean, it's great to see the 17th century is finally kind of having its day, I think, in the popular imagination. So I mean, it's lovely to see in recent weeks, you know, there's books on this period written. Alice Hunt's new book, which she's doing a talk for us this coming week, Henry Rees, Ronald Hutton, and so on. In terms of a sort of introductory guide, certainly for adults, I'd recommend Jonathan Healy's book, The Blazing World, which I think is superb as a sort of introduction to the 17th century, both because I think it gives that whole idea of the sort of long 17th century from sort of, you know, the whole of the Stuart period, if you like. And of course, it's written with, I think, a great deal of scholarship behind it, but it's also very accessible. And Jonathan, of course, you know, he's very witty, as those who follow him on social media will know.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, if you're looking for an introduction as a sort of a way into this period, I'd sort of start with that, and then work your way in from there. Pick out which bit sort of interests you. I think also that book is interesting because it doesn't pigeonhole it up. We tend to pigeonhole. There's the Jacobean periods, there's Charles I, there's the Civil War, there's the Republic, then there's the Restoration, then there's the Glorious Revolution, and actually it's all the same people. You know, it's one long continuous, one long story that you can't really separate them out, and I think that's why that sort of book actually is really good.
Cool. Well, thank you for that. In that same vein, you mentioned earlier about some of the films, some of the series that you liked. Now, dare I ask what you think about Cromwell?
Yeah, well, if you're interested, go to our YouTube channel because there's a whole review I did on this a couple of years ago.
Oh, brilliant! Yes.
Yeah, there is also I did a few years ago during the pandemic. I did a Twitter feed where they were showing it on BBC Two one night, and I did a tweet along to it, which for anybody who reads a tweet along, it is, looking back on it, quite funny because I was getting increasingly exasperated, and it was fueled by several glasses of wine by that stage.
Oh.
I mean, the film itself, although it has its flaws, and they are many, because it gets an awful lot of stuff wrong. I think it's big, it's colourful, it's exciting, and it's a really good way, that kind of entry point into the period, and it sort of, you know, gets people interested in it. And I think some of the kind of performances, Richard Harris, although a little dour, he's very good as Cromwell, and Alec Guinness is obviously great as Charles I.
Yeah.
I think what's also interesting is I've got a bit of a detective story I want to do at some point or another and try and track down the missing 45 minutes of the film. Because originally it was supposed to be 45 minutes longer.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Yeah, so the original cut of the film was 45 minutes longer, and this is not the sort of, the early edit took up the bit that was supposed to be actually released was nearly 45 minutes longer, and it was cut at the last minute, partly for the time reasons, the distributors, partly for political reasons, because they'd actually depict Cromwell's campaign in Ireland in it. And in 1970, when the film was released, the Troubles were kicking off in Ireland at the time, in Northern Ireland at the time. So because it was so politically sensitive, they cut those bits out. Mm-hmm. Now, interestingly, we've got the novelisation of Cromwell in the museum's collection, and actually includes that and all sorts of other bits and pieces in the text that aren't actually in the film. And there's even some film stills in it. There's a film still of Richard Harris as Cromwell standing in the sort of set of a burnt-out church in Drogheda, which of course isn't in the film. But obviously, it made it to the point where it was in the novelisation. So it's obviously interesting that was edited. And I'd be really interested to know whether that missing bit of the film still exists somewhere, because it would be lovely to see that restored. And actually, it would probably make the film make a bit more sense, because it sort of, as the film goes on, it starts to make less and less sense, because you can obviously tell more and more bits have been chopped out of it.
Wow. That's incredible. I didn't know about that. Well, hope you can find that, the missing
Fingers crossed.
Bit of that film.
So, well, it's a future project when I have some time. He said, trying hard not to laugh horribly.
And then you'll have to write a new review.
Well, I will, yes. And we're thinking of doing an exhibition in the future looking at depictions of Cromwell on film. So I'd have to say, I don't think the film Cromwell is a bad one necessarily. I would recommend By the Sword Divided. The one I'd steer absolutely clear of is To Kill a King, the one from the early 2000s with, it's Dougray Scott is very good as Fairfax in it, but Tim Roth is utterly miscast as Cromwell, and Rupert Everett, much as he's great, is very strange watching the world's tallest Charles I. He's bigger than anybody else in every scene.
It's funny that, because he did a pretty good Charles II, I think. He's much more physically suited to that. I thought he was good. What was that in Stage Beauty? He was Charles II in that.
Although my favourite Charles II, I have to say, I did like the BBC one. Was it The Power and the Passion, the one with Rufus Sewell in it?
I really like that.
Which I thought was brilliant. I think it's one of my favourite depictions of Charlie too.
I also really like The Devil's Whore. That I enjoyed that, even though it has supernatural elements and everything.
There's some bits about it I really enjoy, and I think I think Michael Fassbender is great as Thomas Rainsborough in that. And I think actually Dominic West is a really good Cromwell actually in that.
Yeah, I think he was.
He's got both the charismatic side of him and the action side, and also the slightly wily side to him as well. So the politician in there. So actually, I don't dismiss The Devil's Whore.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, this is one of my favorite parts now. It is time for you to talk about your fantasy dinner party in the Stuart period. Who would you invite? What would you serve? And who would you have sitting next to you? Because that's quite important.
It is. Yeah, I mean, I'll be tempted to say Cromwell, but I'm not sure. I suspect it would be quite a dull dinner party that he'd end up sermonising all the way through it. So, although either that or he'd be just doing practical jokes all the time, it could go either way. So there's part of that. I think if you want a good night and a good party, Samuel Pepys has definitely got to be one of those. Although you probably want to keep a close eye on him if there are any women present, because his reputation in that part, philanderer, I think, is the polite word for it.
Yes, but as one lady had it, she had the right idea. You just have a pin, then he doesn't bother you anymore.
I think that's definitely the case. So I think some of those. I'd love to have met Thomas Fairfax. I think he's a fascinating character, and I think he's one of my sort of heroes from this period. People I definitely would not want there. The two people, I mean, one I find we have a running debate with one of our Twitter followers, John Gillibrand, about this is William Prynne, the most the man who's the biggest killjoy in 17th century history. So you wouldn't want Prynne at a dinner party.
I agree with you. Yep.
And probably the most despicable character who you wouldn't want to do in a party in this period is Titus Oates, who I think is one of the most loathsome creatures in the whole of the 17th century.
Yeah. I refer to him as a serial loser in one of my books. I can't stand him. No,
not a pleasant man. So I mean, if you're going to invite a monarch, it's got to be Charlie too, really, hasn't it? Because I mean, the party king. You'd have a good night with him. So, and I think also the other one I'd be fascinated to talk to is Milton. I think Milton's a fascinating character.
A great mind.
Yeah, a great mind. He's the man who you'd want to spend sort of the long evening after everybody else had sort of sunk under the table with alcohol, actually having a serious conversation.
Yes, I think that would be a fascinating discussion. One of the great minds of the 17th century and history in general, I think.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah.
Fantastic. All right, and what would you serve them? Not just ales.
Well, actually, I mean, I have tried some of the recipes from Mrs. Cromwell's cookbook, and despite the fact it's used as a piece of anti-Cromwell propaganda, I do think that some of the recipes in there are actually used by the Cromwell family. There are bits of human detail in there, sort of, that do show. I suspect that probably the royalists got hold of a sort of recipe volume from Whitehall or from Hampton Court after the Cromwells departed, and then sort of exaggerated to it. So there's a very nice beef cooked in the French fashion, which I'm rather partial to, which is beef, basically beef stewed in ale, which is very, very nice recipe, and I do recommend. So it's sort of a kind of carbonaded beef, and then a sort of lemon posset type thing afterwards. So that I have to say, I think would probably be quite a nice sort of section for the dinner that evening.
Yeah, well, that sounds delightful. Lovely. Very nice.
Not eels, though. Don't do eels.
Hey, but didn't a medieval king really like his eels?
Yes, there's one of them. Is it one of them dies of a surfeit of lampreys or whatever? I can't remember which one it is.
I can't remember who it was. My friend Catherine, she's Catherine Warner. She would know. Well, that's fantastic. I'd like to try eel someday. I know it sounds funny, but I mean, I'm up for any of that.
Well, I mean, come down to visit us. We'll go over to see our friends in Ely, where they do still serve eels, and some of the places around there as well. It's a little less common here in Huntingdon, but the Ely, the Isle of Eels, they do still have places where they serve. They give the eel fair every year. They do serve eels.
Well, I'm up for that. I'll totally do that. Yes, yeah. I haven't gone to the museum yet because I live in Derbyshire, so it's a bit of a trek, I think, but definitely worth it. So I'd like to go to Cambridgeshire and all that area around there, full of history and lots of things to see.
Well, we have talked about maybe organising a sort of 17th century festival, and maybe the Huntingdon, with all its associations with Pepys and Charles I, Charles II, James I, Cromwell's, of course. Maybe that's a place to hold that in the future. So maybe we can get you down here and we'll do a 17th century festival at some point.
I would love to do that. I am here for Stuart Festival. Absolutely. Well, many thanks, Stuart, for chatting with me today. It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Goodbye.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye. Well, if you'd like to learn more about the Cromwell Museum, please visit www.cromwellmuseum.org. Well, I'm currently reading, I just started this. It's, Providence Lost, The Rise and Fall of Cromwell's Protectorate by Paul Lay. I started this about 2 days ago, but I'm finding it quite gripping already. And I was wondering if you are interested in being part of the 17th Century Lady Book Club, which I had going about a year or so ago. If you're interested in that, I would be up for restarting it. And this will be the book that we start with. Okay. I'll figure out which platform we'll be using and I'll write a blog post about it and share it on social media. So this is it by Paul Lay. There we go. I hope you enjoyed today's show, which was, as always, produced by Gavin Orland of Orland Media Limited. That's all for this episode, and I do hope you join us next month for our special Stuart Christmas show. Until then, don't forget to keep it Stuart. Goodbye.